On my 23rd birthday, when I introduced my fiancé, my cruel stepmom stood up and shouted, "How dare you choose your life partner, a beggar? Leave him immediately." I refused and said, "I will choose my life partner. It's my life." Furious, she slapped me hard and ordered security to throw me out of the event. But nobody could have predicted how the next 2 hours would turn the event completely upside down. My name is Dorothy Carter, and for as long as I can remember, my life has been a script written by someone else. That someone is my stepmother, Stephanie Carter. She's always been the one in charge, not just of the house, but of our lives, our choices, and every step we were allowed to take. My father, Thomas, never objected. He stood by her, silent and complicit, letting her rule over everything. Growing up in Austin, Texas, I lived in a house that was more like a museum than a home. It was pristine, grand, and suffocating all at once. Stephanie's influence was everywhere, from the perfectly coordinated furniture to the way we were told to behave at the dinner table. Nothing was ever truly ours. It was all a reflection of her power. When my mother passed away when I was 6, Stephanie entered our lives. At first, she seemed kind, almost warm, as if she was trying to fill the void left behind. But it didn't take long for her true nature to show. She demanded perfection, and she expected loyalty, absolute, unquestioning loyalty. She made sure that every decision I made was one she approved of, from what I wore to which friends I was allowed to see. My opinions? They didn't matter. By the time I was a teenager, I had learned to keep my head down. It was easier to comply than to fight. My father always told me, "Stephanie knows what's best for us." Even when I wanted to scream, I stayed silent. But that silence came at a cost. Slowly, I felt myself slipping away, losing the person I was meant to be. It wasn't until my 23rd birthday that everything changed. Stephanie decided to throw a grand party, her version of a celebration. The guest list was full of people I barely knew, business associates, high society friends, and anyone who could enhance her reputation. The decorations were over the top, the kind of extravagance that screamed wealth and status. It was her show like everything else in our lives. But I had plans of my own that night. I had been keeping a secret, one that I knew would turn her carefully curated world upside down. Ethan Blake, my fiancé. Ethan wasn't part of Stephanie's elite circle. He wasn't wealthy or influential. He was just a hardworking small business owner who cared about me for who I was, not for what I represented. I had kept our relationship hidden, knowing Stephanie would never approve. But I was done hiding. This was my life, and it was time to take control. When the moment came, I stood in the middle of the room, surrounded by guests sipping champagne and making polite conversation. My heart was racing, but I knew I couldn't back down. I called for everyone's attention, and as the room fell silent, I introduced Ethan. "This is Ethan Blake," I said, my voice steady despite the tension. "My fiancé." The room erupted into whispers and gasps, but none of that mattered. All I could focus on was Stephanie's face. Her expression shifted from confusion to fury in an instant. She stepped forward, her voice cutting through the noise like a knife. "What did you just say?" she demanded. "I'm engaged to Ethan," I replied, meeting her gaze. "And we're getting married." Her laugh was cold and sharp, the kind of laugh that made my stomach churn. "How dare you make this decision without consulting me? Do you have any idea how this makes our family look?" I clenched my fists, my voice rising with every word. "This isn't about our family's image. This is about me. My life. And I will choose my partner." Stephanie's face twisted in anger. "You idiot," she spat. "How dare you talk back to me like this?" Before I could react, her hand came down hard across my face. The room fell silent as a sharp gasp escaped from the crowd. My cheek stung, but the pain was nothing compared to the humiliation. She turned to the security guard stationed at the entrance, her voice cold and commanding. "Get her out of here. Now." I stood frozen as the guards approached, but I didn't move. I wouldn't give her the satisfaction of seeing me crumble. Then I looked at my father, hoping, praying, that he would step in. But he didn't. He just stood there, his face pale, his hands clenched at his sides. He said nothing. My heart broke in that moment. The man who was supposed to protect me, who should have stood by me, was siding with her. As the guards grabbed my arms and led me toward the door, I saw my uncle, Lucas, stepping forward. He pushed through the crowd, his voice firm. "Stop. She's coming with me." Stephanie glared at him, but Lucas didn't back down. He took my arm and led me out of the house. As we walked to his car, I felt a mix of relief and despair. I had lost my family, or at least the illusion of one, but I wasn't alone. When we reached Lucas's house, he handed me a cup of tea and sat beside me. "Dorothy," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "you don't have to face this alone. I'm here for you." Tears filled my eyes as I nodded. For the first time in years, I felt a glimmer of hope. I didn't know what would come next, but one thing was certain. I was done being controlled. This was the beginning of a new chapter, and I was ready to fight for the life I deserved. After the chaos of that night, I moved into my Uncle Lucas's modest but warm home in a quieter part of Austin. It wasn't grand or lavish like the Carter estate, but it felt more like home than anywhere I'd lived in years. For the first time, I was free from Stephanie's suffocating control. But the sting of betrayal lingered, especially for my father. He had chosen her, yet again, over his own daughter. That wound would take a long time to heal, if it ever did. Lucas was my anchor during those initial weeks. He didn't push me to talk, but when I finally poured out my heart, he listened patiently. "I can't just let her get away with this," I said one evening as we sat in his living room. "She's ruined everything. She treats us like puppets, and my father, he just lets her." Lucas nodded thoughtfully. "You don't have to let this go, Dorothy. If you want justice, you have every right to fight for it. But be smart about it. Stephanie is powerful. She won't go down easily." That conversation planted a seed in my mind. Stephanie had built her life on control, manipulation, and appearances. What if those appearances weren't as flawless as she wanted everyone to believe? I needed to know what she was hiding. A few days later, I reached out to James Miller, a private investigator Lucas had recommended. When James arrived at the coffee shop where we'd agreed to meet, he seemed unassuming, average height, slightly graying hair, with a no-nonsense demeanor. "I've heard about your stepmother," he said after I explained the situation. "People like her rarely keep their hands clean. Let me do some digging." It felt surreal, hiring someone to investigate my own family. But this wasn't just about me anymore. Stephanie had hurt too many people, and I wasn't going to let her continue unchecked. The days that followed were a blur of anticipation and anxiety. I threw myself into helping Lucas around the house, trying to keep my mind off the investigation. Ethan, my fiancé, was my rock during this time. He didn't blame me for what had happened at the party, though I had worried he might feel overwhelmed by all the drama. Instead, he stood by me, reassuring me with his steady presence. "I can't believe she did that to you," Ethan said one evening as we sat on Lucas's porch. "But I'm proud of you for standing up to her." "I just hope it was worth it," I said softly. "She's not the kind of person who lets things go." Ethan took my hand. "Whatever happens, we'll face it together." A week later, James called me. "Dorothy, I think you'll want to see what I've found," he said, his voice calm but charged with urgency. We met at his office the next morning, and he laid out a file on the desk between us. As he began to speak, my stomach twisted. "Stephanie Carter isn't who she pretends to be," James began. "On the surface, she's a socialite and a philanthropist, but underneath, well, it's a different story." He detailed everything he had uncovered: shady business dealings, secret offshore accounts, and most shockingly, her connection to a local criminal gang involved in money laundering. "She's been funneling money through fake charities and using her influence to cover it up," James explained. "I've got the evidence to prove it." I stared at the file, my mind racing. It was worse than I had imagined. Stephanie wasn't just manipulative, she was dangerous. "This could ruin her," I said, my voice trembling with a mix of fear and determination. James nodded. "It will, if you're ready to take it public. But be prepared. This won't be easy. She'll fight back." I knew he was right, But the thought of Stephanie finally facing consequences for her actions was too powerful to ignore. I thanked James and left his office, the weight of the evidence heavy in my hands. As I walked back to Lucas's house, my resolve hardened. Stephanie had built her empire on lies, and it was time for those lies to come crashing down. That evening, I sat with Lucas and Ethan, sharing what James had uncovered. "You're sure about this?" Lucas asked, his expression a mix of concern and pride.
"I'm sure," I replied.
"She's hurt too many people, and she needs to be stopped." Ethan squeezed my hand. "We'll stand by you no matter what." With their support, I contacted a lawyer the next day. The evidence James had gathered was damning, and together, we filed a case against Stephanie. The legal process began to unfold, and as the days turned into weeks, I felt a mixture of fear and exhilaration. This was the fight of my life, and I wasn't backing down. But Stephanie wasn't idle during this time. I started receiving veiled threats, anonymous phone calls, and messages meant to scare me into dropping the case. One night, a rock was thrown through Lucas's front window, shattering the glass and leaving us shaken. "She's trying to intimidate you," Lucas said, his voice firm. "Don't let her win." "I won't," I replied, though my hands trembled as I cleaned up the shards of glass. Ethan insisted on staying with us after that, and James helped us increase security around the house. Despite the fear, I refused to give up. This wasn't just about me anymore. Stephanie's actions had hurt countless others, and it was time for her reign of terror to end. As the court date loomed closer, I found myself standing taller, speaking with more confidence. For the first time, I felt like I was reclaiming my voice. Stephanie had underestimated me, and she was about to learn that I wasn't the frightened girl she thought she could control. The night before the trial, Ethan took my hands in his and said, "No matter what happens tomorrow, I'm proud of you. You've already won by standing up for yourself." His words filled me with strength. Tomorrow, the truth would come out, and Stephanie Carter's world would never be the same. The courtroom was packed. Reporters with cameras hovered outside, eager to catch every detail of what was shaping up to be the scandal of the year in Austin. Inside, the atmosphere buzzed with tension. I sat beside my lawyer, my palms damp and my heart pounding. Across the room sat Stephanie, composed as ever, her icy demeanor betraying no hint of fear. But I knew better. She was a woman who thrived on control, and today, that control was slipping. The trial began with the prosecution laying out the evidence James Miller had uncovered. They detailed Stephanie's elaborate money laundering schemes and her connection to a local criminal gang. Each revelation felt like a blow against the carefully constructed image she had maintained for years. The courtroom listened in stunned silence as records of offshore accounts, forged documents, and testimonies from former associates were presented. Stephanie's lawyer tried to discredit the evidence, but it was a losing battle. The facts were undeniable. When James took the stand as a witness, his testimony was clear and methodical. He explained how he had traced funds through fake charities and connected this to Stephanie's illegal operations. I watched her face closely, searching for cracks in her mask. There it was, a flicker of panic in her eyes when James mentioned a wire transfer to one of the gang leaders. She was cornered, and she knew it. When it was my turn to testify, my stomach churned. I stood, took a deep breath, and told the truth. I described my life under Stephanie's control, how she manipulated everyone around her, and how she had humiliated me in front of the world at my own birthday party. I recounted the investigation and the threats I had received. I wanted the court to understand that this wasn't just about me. It was about everyone Stephanie had exploited and hurt. She used her influence to silence anyone who got in her way, I said, my voice steady despite the lump in my throat. She believed she was untouchable. But no one should have that kind of power. As I spoke, I felt a strange mix of emotions, fear, anger, and finally, a sense of liberation. For so long, Stephanie's voice had drowned out my own, but not anymore. I was finally being heard. The turning point came when a former associate of Stephanie's testified against her. He was part of the criminal gang and had struck a deal with the prosecution for a reduced sentence. His testimony was the final nail in her coffin. He confirmed everything James had uncovered and revealed even more: Stephanie's involvement in blackmail and intimidation tactics to keep her operations hidden. The courtroom was silent as his words sank in. Stephanie's lawyer sat motionless, knowing there was no way to spin this. For the first time, Stephanie looked truly shaken. Her composure cracked, and I saw the fear she had tried so hard to hide. When the judge delivered the verdict, guilty on multiple counts of money laundering, fraud, and criminal conspiracy, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. Stephanie was sentenced to several years in prison. The woman who had controlled every aspect of my life was finally facing justice. As the court session ended, my father approached me. He looked older, more fragile, as if the weight of the truth had aged him overnight. "Dorothy," he began, his voice trembling. I didn't know. If I had known." I cut him off, my tone firm but not unkind.
"You chose to stand by her, Dad. Even when you saw how she treated me, you did nothing."
He looked down, guilt etched into his features. "I was weak. I let her control me too. But I see now what I've lost, and I'm so sorry." His apology came too late. For years, I had waited for him to protect me, to stand up for me. But he never did. I couldn't forget that. "I can't do this, Dad," I said, shaking my head. "I can't forgive you, not now." He nodded, tears in his eyes. "I understand," he said softly before walking away, his shoulders slumped. For the first time, I saw him as he was, not the strong father I had once believed in, but a man broken by his own choices. As I left the courthouse with Ethan and Lucas by my side, I felt a mix of emotions: sadness for the family I had lost, pride in the fight I had won, and hope for the future I was building. Stephanie's reign of terror was over, but my journey wasn't finished yet. There was still so much ahead: my wedding, my life with Ethan, and the freedom to live on my own terms. That day, I walked out of the courthouse not as Dorothy Carter, the controlled and silent stepdaughter, but as Dorothy, a woman who had fought for justice and reclaimed her voice. The days after the trial were a whirlwind of emotions. Stephanie was sentenced to a lengthy prison term, and her empire crumbled in the aftermath. News of her conviction spread quickly, and her name became synonymous with greed and corruption. Watching her fall from grace should have felt like a triumph, but instead, I felt an odd mix of sadness and relief. She had shaped so much of my life, albeit in all the wrong ways, and now she was finally out of it. My father, Thomas, filed for divorce shortly after the trial. He tried to reconcile with me, showing up unannounced at Lucas's house one afternoon. "Dorothy," he began, his voice filled with regret. "I've lost everything: your mother, Stephanie, and now you. Please let me make things right." I looked at him, searching for the man I had once idolized. But all I saw was someone who had stood idly by while Stephanie destroyed everything. "Dad," I said, my voice calm but firm, "it's too late. You had years to stand up for me, and you didn't. I can't trust you now." He nodded slowly, his face crumpling with sorrow. "I understand," he said softly. "I just hope that someday you'll find it in your heart to forgive me." As he walked away, I felt a sense of finality. It was painful, but it was necessary. My father had made his choices, and now I had to make mine. And my choice was to move forward without him. Ethan and I decided to move to Dallas, leaving the shadow of Austin behind us. With Lucas's help, we found a cozy apartment in a vibrant neighborhood. It wasn't grand, but it was ours, a place where we could start fresh and build a life together. Planning our wedding became a joyful distraction. We kept it simple and intimate, inviting only close friends and family. Lucas walked me down the aisle, his face beaming with pride. As I stood across from Ethan, holding his hands, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. He had stood by me through the darkest times, and now we were stepping into the light together. "I promise to stand by you, always," Ethan said during his vows, his voice steady and full of love. "To support you in your dreams, to celebrate your victories, and to face every challenge by your side." Tears welled in my eyes as I replied, and I promise to do the same. To love you for who you are, to cherish our life together, and to never let anyone take away our happiness. As we exchanged rings and kissed, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. For the first time in years, I wasn't thinking about Stephanie or my father. I was thinking about us, about the future we were creating. Life in Dallas was everything I had hoped for. I threw myself into my new job at a nonprofit organization, helping underserved communities access education and resources. It was work that made me feel fulfilled, like I was making a real difference. Ethan continued to run his small business, pouring his heart into every project. We found joy in the little things, lazy Sunday mornings, exploring the city, and dreaming about what was next. But moving on wasn't always easy. Nightmares of the slap, the threats, and the betrayal still haunted me at times. Ethan encouraged me to talk to a therapist, and for the first time, I allowed myself to process everything I had been through. The sessions were hard, forcing me to confront the pain I had buried for years, but they were healing. Slowly, the nightmares faded, replaced by a sense of peace. One evening, Ethan showed me a news clip on his phone. Stephanie had given an interview from prison, claiming she had been misunderstood and blaming others for her downfall. I watched for a moment before turning away. "She's still trying to control the narrative," I said, shaking my head. Ethan nodded. "But the world knows the truth now. She can't hurt you anymore."
And he was right.
Stephanie's reign over my life was truly over. 3 years after the trial, I returned to Austin for the first time. A charity gala was being held in Lucas's honor, and I wanted to be there to support him. Walking into the grand venue, I felt a flicker of unease, memories of the past threatening to resurface. But then I saw Lucas's face, full of pride and warmth, and I knew I had made the right choice. To my surprise, my father was there. He approached me hesitantly, his eyes searching mine. "Dorothy," he said softly, "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I wanted to say I'm proud of you. You've become everything I wasn't brave enough to be." I didn't respond immediately, letting his words sink in. Finally, I nodded. "Thank you," I said simply, and we parted ways without further conversation. It wasn't reconciliation, but it was closure. As Ethan and I drove back to Dallas that night, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. The scars of the past would always be there, but they no longer defined me. I had fought for my freedom, my happiness, and my future, and I had won. This was my story. Not one of defeat, but of resilience. Of finding justice and building a life worth living. And as I looked at Ethan, his hand resting gently on mine, I knew the best chapters were still to come.